Our Divided Political Heart grew out of my love for the American story, including its paradoxes and contradictions. I believe that the classic American balance between individualism and community, between liberty and solidarity, I believe these balances have helped us out of many scrapes before and can do so again.
This is the Miller Center Forum from the University of Virginia. I'm Doug Blackman. Our guest today is E.J. Dionne, renowned columnist for the Washington Post, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a professor at Georgetown University, and author or editor of many volumes. Earlier this year, Mr. Dionne published an important new book. At its core, it is a Jeremiad against the Tea Party, and what he argues is its cynical contortion of American history. Not everyone would agree with his conclusions about that. Indeed, a lively forum would simultaneously present E.J. Dionne and the radio talk show host Glenn Beck. We'll save that for another day. But Dionne's book is much more than that. On another level, it is a sharp critique of President Obama's failure to accurately read the political environment immediately after the historic election of 2008. More importantly, it is a broad and scholarly survey of an idea that is critical to the Miller Center, and that is that history and its lessons should inform the decisions we make as a nation in the present. Our Divided Political Heart also incisively explores two key issues in American discourse and questions that we will return to in this program repeatedly over the next year. The first is whether the American century has come to an end and been replaced by a great American decline. The second is what now? In the wake of the bitter presidential election of 2012, how do we begin to mend the divided American heart? Please welcome E.J. Dionne.
Thank you so much. That was such a generous introduction. As I said from the back, I don't know about Glenn Beck there, but it was so much nicer an introduction I once received in the Midwest, where the introduction ended, and now for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. And it's also, by the way, nicer than some of the email you get. I don't know if any of you read the comments under columnists' columns. I think it's good because, we journalists get a reputation for a certain amount of arrogance. Indeed, a lot of people think we earn that reputation. And so our readers really hold us in check, and people tend to write you more when they disagree than when they agree. I think it says something about human nature. My favorite, which I can actually repeat at this august place, began, "Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person?" And so whatever else you get from coming here today, you'll be able to answer that question for yourself. And I also want to thank the friends in the other room, in the overflow room. It's awfully nice of you folks to be here, too. I have to say right at the outset that, A, it's always an honor to be at the Miller Center. This is an extraordinary place. But B, I am here in Charlottesville out of a combination of affection and gratitude. The affection goes back a long way. My wife went to the University of Virginia Law School, and while she was in law school, I lived out in Keswick and wrote most of my first book, Why Americans Hate Politics. And I just absolutely fell in love with this place. I am persuaded that Charlottesville is one of the greatest places in the world, and the only people who disagree with that have never been to Charlottesville. So we have to encourage them to come in the interests of knowledge and experience. But also, it's a feeling of gratitude. I am very grateful to so many scholars here at UVA who have taught me so much over the years. And one of them is here in the audience, Brian Baylaw. And if you read the book, you will see how important Brian and the Miller Center are to me, because I believe it was the last time I was here at the Miller Center. Brian told me about a very important book He didn't put it that way, I'm telling you this. A very important book he wrote called A Government Out of Sight. And he said, you're really going to like this book. And he gave it to me. And if you are so kind as to read Our Divided Political Heart, you will see how deeply important Brian's argument is to my argument. And the research he did is to the findings I offer in my book. And I also want to salute him and the Miller Center for the Miller Center National Fellowship, which has encouraged dissertation completion, particularly for people who are writing in political history. And it's a fact that for a long time, political history receded as a field, American political history, in the historical field generally. And it is making a roaring comeback. There are some extraordinary young scholars, some of whom I refer to in my book, who have done spectacular work over the last 20 years, and the Miller Center is part of that. So I just want to salute them for that. Also, it was nice to run into Governor Beliles. I realized, it was very kind of him to come today, I realized that Virginia has a more really good or great ex-governors than any state in the Union. And then I realized it's because you guys cheat and have that stupid 4-year term limit where you deny the voters the right to re-elect anybody good. But it means you produce this extraordinary group of experienced people, and I'm very honored that Governor Beliles, one of them, is here today. I want to talk a bit about the thesis of the book, and I will relate it only tangentially to a certain event that is 29 days away, although in the Q&A I'll be happy to talk about that. Perhaps about debates, if anybody wants to bring up that subject. I will only say that I know we could argue about exactly what happened in that debate, but we do know that Obama supporters were somewhat disappointed at times. And my favorite story about this, which is a true story, is that a dear friend of mine, he and his wife were both strong Obama supporters, and he told me the story that the night of the debate, she went to bed and sat bolt upright in bed and thought she was having a terrible nightmare and realized all she was doing was remembering the debate. And so that was the experience. Now, but we could talk about that in more detail if you wish, or we could skip on to the next debates, as some of us would like to do. We Americans are a confusing people, and I think we are confusing to ourselves especially. The self-portraits we create are often contradictory. You can see that in our music, in our movies, in our literature. Is our country better personified by the communitarianism of Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, or by the rogue individualism of Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry, or for that matter, the Clint Eastwood of the Chrysler ad or the Clint Eastwood of the Republican convention? Does Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land or Frank Sinatra's My Way say something more important or more true about who we are? Is the American experiment unique because it respects the importance of solidarity illustrated in the novels of John Steinbeck, or because it acknowledges the sanctity of independence as celebrated by Jack Kerouac when he goes on the road? Our Divided Political Heart grew out of my love for the American story, including its paradoxes and tensions and contradictions. There's a paradox right at the beginning of my book because I refer right away to worries about American decline, which I think have been with us now for a decade or more. Yet the book is very distinctly not a declinist book. I'm an anti-declinist. It's actually a hopeful book about our future because I believe that the classic American balance, which is at the core of my argument, between individualism and community, between liberty and solidarity, and also our balances between government and the marketplace and the public and the private, I believe these balances have helped us out of many scrapes before and can do so again. I always love to quote Winston Churchill, who offered my very favorite line on Americans. Many of you know it. Americans, can always be counted on to do the right thing, Churchill said, after they have exhausted all of the other possibilities. So we have trouble, but we eventually get there as a people and as a nation. It's also the case, the fact that we have, over the decades, so many conversations about decline is actually a sign of what a high opinion we have of our nation. We always think we're in a place from which we can decline. And out of those fears of decline have come extraordinary moments in our politics. Feelings of decline usually start in specific worries about foreign policy or about economics, or, as was the case at the end of the Bush administration in 2008, both. But these concerns quickly morph into a sense that we are in a larger crisis, a kind of spiritual crisis. And we inevitably start asking questions, the most basic questions, and the most basic of which I think is, who are we? We debate our history and history's lessons and often disagree about what those lessons are. Barack Obama's election, I think, was very much rooted in the sense that he was the person who could heal this kind of spiritual crisis. Think back to the nature of that campaign, the posters that carried his picture with the single word hope, and also that change we can believe in poster. I have always thought that the word believe in that slogan was at least as important as the word change. And it is no wonder, hope, believe, it is no wonder that the Obama campaign in 2008 often felt like a religious crusade. And so it is no accident, I think, that the Tea Party arose after President Obama's election. I think it was rooted in the same sense of spiritual crisis that the Obama campaign was, and the same fears of decline. And their solution to our crisis was to reach back to the founders. It's fun to talk about the founders at Mr. Jefferson's University, to reach back to the founders and the Constitution. And I have to say that while it is correct that my book is critical of the Tea Party's view, I express a gratitude to the Tea Party, my gratitude at the beginning of the book, because I think it is useful to go back to our founding in figuring out who we are. The Tea Party was right to go back to our origins, and those of us who are on the progressive side of politics need to engage them on this. I think we progressives have often been too willing to leave the argument about American history to our friends on the right end of politics. We have been too reluctant to embrace the American story, which I believe, I would argue to you, is fundamentally a progressive story. Should our conservative friends, and I forgot mine today, but should our conservative friends be the only people who carry around copies of the Constitution in their pockets? Why do we leave quoting the Federalists to conservatives? Why do we leave the Declaration to them? The most forward-looking politicians in our nation's history and the most forward-looking moral leaders always went to our history first. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech drew its inspiration from the promises of our story, and in particular, the promises of our Declaration of Independence. And those of you who have listened to this speech as often as I have over the years can just remember that moment when Dr. King speaks of the promissory note that had been handed to African Americans in the United States and that it had come back stamped unpaid, insufficient funds. He was talking about a promise of American history, and it was a powerful way to make his case. Abraham Lincoln's most important political speech in many ways, the one that many historians think made him the Republican nominee and president, was the speech he gave at Cooper Union in New York City. And the main purpose of that Cooper Union speech was to argue that the founders foresaw, even if many of the founders owned slaves themselves, that the founders foresaw, as he did, the extinction of slavery in the United States. So what do I mean by our divided political heart? Well, the core argument, as I alluded to, is the view that from the very beginning, we Americans have been torn by a deep but healthy tension between our love of individualism and liberty and our affection for community. I do not argue that either of these things should be ruled out of the American story. On the contrary, I think we are all communitarians and all libertarians, again, to paraphrase the good Mr. Jefferson. But I think too often in recent years, we have told our story almost entirely on the individualistic side. We have emphasized individual liberty to the exclusion of our dedication to community and also to equality. We have not focused enough on how the liberty we prize depends upon our willingness to come to the defense of each other's liberty, how liberty depends upon strong communities, energetic government, yes, and a concern for the common good. Consider the very first word of the Constitution of the United States. What's the first word of the? Yes, I love hearing people say we. It's the word we, the people of the United States. And let's listen to the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. Yes, welfare is right there in the first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States. And to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Again, ourselves and our posterity, not just my kids or your kids, ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. I think the Declaration is a perfect reflection of this balance that I'm talking about. It begins by describing the unalienable rights that come from our Creator to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in the very last paragraph of the Declaration, the founders pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. They understood that they and we cannot protect individual liberty unless we act together. I like to go back to that specific list that Mr. Jefferson wrote of complaints against the king. In some ways, the Declaration was the first negative campaign commercial in American history. It makes you think differently about negative campaign commercials. Right? You have the long list of abuses and usurpations. I like to point out that taxes don't come up till the 17th item in the Declaration, and even there, it's not against taxation itself. The founders remonstrated against the British Crown for imposing taxes on us without our consent. The first item on their list condemned the king because he refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Note that the signers wanted to pass laws, not repeal them. And they spoke about the public good and not individuals. Second grievance was similar, that the king had forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. Our founders were not anti-government zealots. And when they did get to the great anti-government sentiment in the criticism of government, I love this one, so I will just read it to you. The founders wrote, "He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance." That is such a much better attack than anything you will see in the negative ads put on the air by Karl Rove and the Koch brothers and others this year. So I think you see this dual character of us right there in the Declaration. And we've had a parallel argument related to the role of government in our history. And this is why I think Brian's book is so important. And there's a fact I will report to you in a moment that I did not know until I read Bryant's book. But if you believe that government did not play an important role in building up our nation, then you have to read Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, and a whole lot of other people out of the American story. Let me tell you about the first American version of socialized medicine. In 1798, the great conservative president, John Adams, signed a law creating the Marine Hospital Service, which funded hospitals across the nation to treat sailors who were sick and injured on the job. I have to tell you that a significant mistake I once made was to use the word seamen instead of sailors on the Jon Stewart show, and you can only imagine what Jon Stewart did to that, for that. If you want to see a great moment of embarrassment, just check it out online. So, injured sailors, I am careful to say today. So John Adams signed this sweeping, rather substantial piece of healthcare legislation. And I don't know about you, Brian, but I have never found in the American history a record of a mass campaign to repeal Adams Care. This was very early on in our story. Also, if you believe that the Constitution is absolutely clear and can be read only one way, you have to deal with the fact that within the first 3 years of the enactment of the federal Constitution, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, its two leading authors and interpreters in the Federalist, were at each other's throats over whether the federal government had a right to establish the Bank of the United States. This argument about the Constitution was at the foundation of our first party system when the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians organized into the Federalists and the Republicans. My chapter on the Constitution is called One Nation Conceived in Argument, and I couldn't resist and it's true. And I couldn't resist quoting my friend, the legal scholar Garrett Epps, who has an excellent book out recently on the Constitution. Garrett said that Justice Scalia and other originalists root their jurisprudence in the idea that, and I quote, "I knew the founders were friends of mine, I know how they think." The truth is, the Constitution was created out of a series of compromises. It defends competing values right in its core, as former Justice David Souter has said. I think we do ourselves a disservice to think of the founders as unique or sainted, people who received the Constitution as tablets from heaven. The founders were gifted. We do honor them. We should honor them. We have reason to be grateful to them. But they were also adventurous. They were embarking on a radical experiment for their time, rooted in the idea that a people could govern themselves. And to think of the Constitution as a set of shackles designed to keep our country in exactly the same condition it was in 1787 and to prevent us from addressing new problems in new ways does a disservice to the bold and adventurous nature of the founders. And again, to go back to that fight between Hamilton and Madison, if the original guys who wrote the original document had this profound agreement on what the original document said, then what are we to make of the idea of originalism? Hamilton and Clay were both visionaries. It's dangerous, I know, in Charlottesville to speak up in defense of Alexander Hamilton, but I'll do a little of that anyway. They advocated what you could see in retrospect as national planning. Henry Clay called his program the American system. And what's intriguing about this is that he did so to distinguish it from the British system, because the British system was rooted in laissez-faire. So the American idea was different from laissez-faire because we believed that there was a public role to play alongside the role played by the marketplace. I'm not sure the Club for Growth would have liked Henry Clay. Remember, he called for a strong federal role in launching internal improvements, which, by the way, sounds so much nicer than that word infrastructure we use all the time, because that's what internal improvements were: bridges, roads, canals that bound our nation together and fostered commerce. Maybe we would spend adequately on infrastructure if we call them internal improvements. Clay foresaw, as Hamilton did, an important role for the federal government in building us into a manufacturing nation. He was a century ahead of Richard Nixon in proposing what we came to call federal revenue sharing. In frustration, when his opponents were saying that his program for protecting American manufacturers was unconstitutional, Clay exclaimed, "Do we live in the only country in the world with a constitution that is written for other countries but not for ourselves?" And so, like many progressives later on, including FDR, Clay and others expressed frustration with those who did not see the Constitution as a liberating document, but this series of chains. I argue that our friends in the Tea Party are looking back not to the long flow of American history, but to an exceptional period in our history as typical. I'm talking about the period of the Gilded Age, the 35 years after the Civil War, to the ascendancy of Theodore Roosevelt. And this radical individualism had enormous effect, including on Supreme Court decisions. It's in this period where corporations were declared people. The best answer to that, by the way, came from Professor Stephen Colbert. Professor Colbert, when told about this idea, said, "Yes, I want my daughter to grow up and marry a really nice corporation." And this period was a period in which the courts, supporting the conservative view, chose to put all kinds of restrictions on what the federal government could do to regulate a growing economy. The Lochner decision, one of the most famous in 1905, which held that governments couldn't regulate the hours of workers. And so this creates a certain view of the populists and progressives that I hold, that I think is somewhat different than the way they are viewed, not only by the Tea Party, but by others. I view the populists and progressives, yes, as innovative, but I also view them as restoring the broader Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln tradition, which saw the federal government as having an important role in protecting the public interest. Herbert Crowley, the great progressive thinker who influenced Teddy Roosevelt, argued that progressives ought to use Hamiltonian means to serve Jeffersonian ends. They wanted to use an active federal government to ensure greater equality of opportunity and an economy that would not be dominated by the trusts or by very small numbers of people. Those who are looking for encouragement in our current debates can go back to some of the things that both Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson said about trusts and concentrated economic power. There were times when TR and Woodrow Wilson sounded like people who had just walked off an Occupy Wall Street encampment. This is Wilson. The country, he warned, was nearing a time when the power of high finance would be greater than the power of government. Words that would echo down to our time. It's quite astonishing how strong the rhetoric was about the dangers of concentrated economic power. And remember, Wilson and Roosevelt were, in many ways, conservative figures. They were not against capitalism. They were in favor of free competition. But they understood the problems that can be created by monopoly and concentrated power. So in my telling, the populists and the progressives who rebelled against the Gilded Age didn't suddenly introduce big government. They restored the American balance. And if we have sought a balance between individualism and community, we have sought a balance between the state and the market. We've used government in the past to check concentrated private power, even as, yes, we have used constitutional means to check the power of government. I said at the outset that my book is anti-declinist, and it is. I believe that restoring the American balance is essential because it's that traditional American balance that created what we came to call the American century. Being American is a privilege, but it's also an obligation. You sense that when you look at those founding documents and what they were trying to create. When you look at the founders, who were this adventurous group of people, our founders handed us a promise to keep, and our history has been a story of a steady expansion of democracy in our efforts to keep that promise. We first extended the franchise from property owners to all white men. We eventually expanded it to African Americans, took it away, and then after years of struggle, African Americans won it back. We extended the franchise to women. We created much broader economic opportunity in our nation. So we have an obligation to our republic, to the generations who came before us, and to those who will come after. In the 100 years after Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency in 1901, government grew, but so did individual liberty. The state assumed new roles, but individual opportunities expanded. New regulations protected the air and the water and the integrity of food and drugs and the safety of workplaces and consumer products, and American capitalism flourished. Workers organized into unions that advanced the interests of those who depended on their labor, not capital, for their livelihoods. In doing so, labor organizations, which, by the way, go all the way back to the Jacksonian period, strengthened a more social form of capitalism based on widespread property ownership and upward mobility. Previously excluded groups were brought into the larger American community to share in our country's bounty. And we continued to welcome newcomers and created the most diverse democracy in the world. Now, I think all this was enabled by what I call in the book the long consensus. And I think we were governed under this long consensus from Teddy Roosevelt forward. It was a long consensus that honored the role of markets, but also saw the important role played by the state. It honored individual liberty, but also saw the importance of building community to undergird that liberty. And I believe that the long consensus is now under attack as it has not been since the Gilded Age. I think we need to recognize that our friends in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement have actually strayed quite far from their own history and their own past commitments. This is the only book you will read in the next 20 years, except perhaps written by members of his own family, that gives a very important role to the late Senator Jacob Javits of New York. Some of you may remember Senator Javits. He was a very liberal Republican. And he was asked, what are you doing in the Republican Party? And Javits said, my party, our party, the party of Hamilton, Clay, Lincoln, and Teddy Roosevelt, has always been the party of national action. And I think that is a piece of the Republican tradition that has atrophied. Similarly, I think the conservative movement has always placed a strong emphasis on the role of community. Indeed, in many ways, conservatism began as a rebellion on behalf of community against a certain kind of individualism in the late 17th century. I like to remind people that William F. Buckley, one of my heroes, actually, even though that will surprise some people in this room, I want to be about 5% as effective from my side as Buckley was for his side. And incidentally, he's my hero for another reason, and it's something that's defective about our current way of talking about politics. If you remember his show Firing Line, Buckley used to invite really smart liberals whom he respected to argue with. So these weren't arguments rooted in hatred or disrespect. He wasn't trying to find straw people to knock down. He wanted to have really intelligent people like John Kenneth Galbraith, like the late Michael Harrington. I'm the author of the book, The Other America, written 50 years ago about poverty. I always like to bring that up because Buckley did have a great line on my dear friend Michael Harrington. Harrington was once introduced as being America's leading socialist, and Bill Buckley, I wish I could do a really good Buckley with the pen in hand, those of you who remember him, but America's leading socialist, Buckley said, that would be a bit like being the tallest building in Topeka. Anyway, Bill Buckley Bill Buckley wrote a wonderful book called Gratitude. And in his book, Gratitude, he said that all of us owe something back to this nation that nurtured us and protected us. And I swear if Bill Buckley, many ways the founder of modern conservatism, ran in a primary these days and ran on the program of the book Gratitude, he'd lose. And I think that this is a problem that our conservative friends have to face. Some of them know this. Some of them, I've actually gotten an interesting response to my book from some conservatives. David Brooks actually had a column on this recently. That by jettisoning their communitarian commitments, by adopting a highly restrictive view of government's role, and by advancing in the Supreme Court, no less than on the campaign trail, a view of the Constitution that would prohibit or restrict activities that the government has undertaken for a century or more, I think conservatives are breaking from their own best traditions. And so we have the big fight in our politics. When the two sides do not operate within the same framework, identify the same problems, or even share a common understanding of our history, the difficulty of finding accord cannot just be ascribed to pettiness or selfishness or a lack of imagination. It really does reflect the fact that the country has reached a time of choosing, to echo Ronald Reagan's memorable 1964 speech on behalf of Barry Goldwater. As I say, although I am unapologetically critical of conservatism in its current form, I would like to see a time when progressives and conservatives could reason together again. And I hope that by pointing out both sides of our political heart, conservatives and progressives might recognize at least a bit of themselves in the other. Conservatives do care about community despite their current political position. They coach sports teams. They participate in PTAs and Rotary clubs and churches and a slew of other forms of community building. Liberals have also care vitally about liberty. Where did the American Civil Liberties Union come from? So perhaps after this election is over, we can sit down and talk again. And so I want to close by doing something that I have to say I always enjoy doing, which is to link the Puritan legacy with the legacy of Bruce Springsteen. Now, how many of you are Bruce Springsteen fans? Any Springsteen fans? Ah, good. Yeah, there are always quite a lot of Springsteen fans when I ask this question. And you will see why Springsteen is relevant. The Puritan I want to quote is John Winthrop, the early governor of Massachusetts. Many of you remember Ronald Reagan used to love the line describing America as a shining city on a hill. Well, that came from John Winthrop's 1630 sermon entitled A Model of Christian Charity. And here's one of my favorite lines from that sermon. Winthrop declared, "We must delight in each other. We must make each other's conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our community as members of the same body." And now to Springsteen. Those of you who know the new album know the refrain on the very first song of that new album. The refrain is, "Wherever this flag is flown, we take care of our own." And I think in a very small number of words, Springsteen has encompassed a great deal of what John Winthrop said in that great sermon of his. And I think both Winthrop and Springsteen, so we're talking about a tradition that goes back to 1630 and continues right now to 2012. And I think both Winthrop and Springsteen speak to some of the very best aspects of us as Americans. And I think we'll honor our past and build a more just and secure future by remembering, as they do, that a nation where liberty thrives requires us to stand with each other and make each other's conditions our own. Thank you very much. Thank you. By the way, if I may, I always love to tell the story of my dear Uncle Ray, who he and I argued about politics for 35 years and 40 years, I think. And when he died, his kids, my cousins, were kind enough to ask me to do the eulogy for him, because they knew, despite our arguments, I really loved him. In the middle of the eulogy, I quoted Richard Nixon. And I quoted Nixon because it was a Nixon quote I liked, but I looked at the folks in the church and I said, actually, the other reason I quoted Nixon is because I was so hoping that if Uncle Ray heard me, he would rise up out of that casket and come to life again just to tell me, I knew you'd be quoting Nixon someday. So I do enjoy real argument.
That's great. Well, let me ask the first question about what must be the most provocative claim in your book, the most provocative argument. You attribute so much of what's best in American life to this long consensus, the long compromise, the long consensus. But then you argue that as it has deteriorated, that now the group that is most likely to recreate the long consensus is the Occupy Wall Street generation. And I'm not sure that everyone here would agree that the Occupy Wall Street movement seems the articulate, well-reasoned, defined goals sufficient to be that generation that brings us a new long consensus.
As Richard Nixon used to say, I'm glad you asked that question, because I guess I wouldn't quite, I do have some good things to say about Occupy Wall Street, and I would say them again. In fact, I think that they whether that movement has any further future as a large-scale movement or whether they sort of go off and do other kinds of organizing, I think they have already accomplished something very, very important, which is to put the issue of economic inequality right back into the center of our discussion. And again, people talk about inequality as if raising it makes you some kind of latter-day socialist. I mean, the issue of equality was there right at the beginning of the Republic. I quote Andrew Jackson's speech about the Bank of the United States. And whether Jackson was actually right or wrong about the bank, the thinking behind his opposition had a lot to do with America's fear of privilege and a privileged class. And so I think that by getting us to talk about the 1%, and one might say 1/10 of 1%, Occupy Wall Street did perform an important role. But my argument in terms of, I don't actually believe that the argument of my book stands or falls on the future of Occupy Wall Street. I think that I think that what we're having now is partly a reaction to what our friends in the Tea Party have done, where people, moderates and progressives, both believe, I think both groups believe, that we don't want to marginalize government's role to the degree that our friends in the Tea Party do. I'm not sure even all our friends in the Tea Party want to marginalize government's role as much as they say they do. They somehow have a slightly different view of Medicare and Social Security than they do of everything else, which might have something to do with the demographics of the Tea Party. And then the other part of my argument is I really do think we need a big argument among conservatives and Republicans. And it is my hope, depending on how this election turns out, that after the election that argument would start. I think that if President Obama wins, and especially if some of the more prominent Tea Party members of Congress lose their seats, there are a lot of Republicans who know in their guts that this direction has been too extreme for the party. They know that it's been too extreme for electoral reasons. Mike Castle would have won that Senate seat in Delaware that Christine O'Donnell could not win. But they also know it from their own tradition. I mean, and you are seeing some Republicans say, we can't just spend all our time opposing any tax increase under any circumstances. And so I think that what I'm talking about, as I say, I'm not sure conservatives will listen to me, but what I hope is they pay some attention and then don't acknowledge me at all and then have this argument among themselves, because I think it's very important to our country's future that they rediscover the fact that they like government more than they let on, and they believe in community more than their current polemical stance would suggest.
Thank you. And a reminder to the audience, if you've got a question, just give me a little auction bid wave, and I'll make my way over to you. This is a question that comes in via Facebook in the category of hostile questions.
Oh, good.
From Jim Woods. I'm shocked that Dionne would blame individualism for poisoning our politics. So the problem is that some of us object to collectivism and tyranny. Really? It has nothing to do with the power lusting of politicians empowered to engage in evil by pragmatism and altruism?
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Mr. Wood. No, I think that the loaded nature of the question is actually very much what I am trying to argue against. I mean, as they would say in a debate, Mr. Wood and I have a fundamental disagreement. I think to use language about our nation's government that implies tyrannical is really a grave mistake about what our government does. Is it tyrannical to provide health care to people who don't have it? Is it tyrannical to give food stamps to kids who are poor? Is it tyrannical to say that people ought to be able to retire? Is it tyrannical to have a public school system? I think some of our pure libertarian friends believe that this is an imposition by government, but I don't believe that. I don't think most of us believe that. And I think that it's this view that the only thing that counts is the size of government. So let me give two examples. Let us think of a country that has a military dictatorship, that has a government that rules out free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, but spends very little on the welfare state. Almost all its budget goes to its security apparatus and to the military. And then let's imagine another country that has a small military but a very large welfare state that really helps people out when they are sick and when they're unemployed and gives generous retirement pensions, lets students go to college for free, and has full liberty of religion and speech and press. Now, which of those two countries are freer? Country number 2, in terms of government share of GDP, has a larger state. I would submit that that is the free country, not the first country that has a military dictatorship that allows us none of our basic freedoms. So I guess what I would like to have that argument with Mr. Wood and those who agree with him, because I don't think that is the measure of what makes us a free society. Indeed, I think we are a freer society when we can sort of increase the freedom from want, as Franklin Roosevelt said, or as John Stuart Mill said, when we can give people help toward doing without help, which is why we have programs to help kids go to college, why we have programs for job training, why we need to do a lot better job at some of those things. But bless you for your question, sir.
Yes, I would just like to ask you, in today's context of our more right-wing friends out there, that Abraham Lincoln, in the later days of his administration, stated that the great threat to the nation post-Civil War would be the rise of the great corporations, and then follow underneath that, almost 100 years later, Eisenhower, in his departing days, spoke of the military-industrial complex being a great threat.
No, I think, and the reason I'm glad you went back to Lincoln, and we can actually go back even farther to the Jacksonian period, is that for Americans to talk about their fears of concentrated power is, again, not a recent invention, not something that was created by Marxists from abroad. It is right at the heart of our tradition. And in the book, I am very critical of the Citizens United decision, for example, because I think the Citizens United decision flies in the face of one of the most important commitments our founders had, which was a commitment to preserve the republic from corruption. Corruption is one of the issues that came up over and over again when the Constitution was being debated. I think that when you have right now about half the money provided to the conservative PACs, as I understand it, is provided by 17 Americans, 17 very, very wealthy Americans. And I know my friend George Will disagrees with me on this, but I think it's very difficult to have free speech when one side threatens to buy the microphone. And I think that Justice Stevens really said it very powerfully. He said of corporations, although they make enormous contributions to our society, corporations are not actually members of it. They cannot vote or run for office because they may be managed and controlled by non-residents. Their interests may conflict in fundamental respects with the interests of eligible voters. It might also be added that corporations have no consciences, no beliefs, no feelings, no thoughts, no desires. Corporations help structure and facilitate the activities of human beings, to be sure, and their personhood often serves as a useful legal fiction, but they are not themselves members of we, the people, by whom and for whom our Constitution was established. That is, amen. Thank you. And that is a very practical view of corporations. When they were initially founded, many of them were joint public and private ventures. And so I would not deny that the corporate form, can be very useful. But I stand with Justice Stevens in saying that it has limits and that corporations, for all the purposes that matter most, are not people, and we shouldn't think of themselves as that.
This question comes from the overflow, those who arrived too late.
I'm a liberal, those who were unable to get here as early as some others.
the evils of a strong central moderator, I guess. This this person in the audience, I'm not sure if it's a man or a woman, first offers a quote from Dwight Eisenhower. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, or eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. Among them are Texas oil millionaires, the occasional politician, a businessman. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid, she quotes Eisenhower saying. So on the basis of that, what would you say, she asks, Eisenhower's reaction would be to the Tea Party today? Could he vote for a Tea Party candidate?
The first thing I want to say is I like Ike. And I've actually always liked Ike. I talk a bit about Eisenhower in my book, and she is absolutely right. He said that he was trying to create what he called at the time modern republicanism. And it was a republicanism sort of like British Toryism under Macmillan, that would accommodate the advances of the New Deal, but to give them a sort of, but be somewhat more sympathetic to private enterprise, perhaps spend a little less, interestingly, including spending a little less on defense. And think about the innovations we had under Dwight Eisenhower. I owe him a personal debt because I was able to go to college partly because of the National Defense Education Act, which was really the first major program after the GI Bill to try to continue some of the good that the GI Bill had done. He also created the interstate highway system. This is very much in the tradition of Clay and Lincoln. So I think in principle, Eisenhower would have a lot of problems with the current Tea Party. And, you know, if you go back in the history of his relationship with the Goldwater movement, it was very complicated. My friend Bill Buckley really disliked Dwight Eisenhower because he understood that Eisenhower was actually hostile to the kind of conservatism that Buckley wanted. I think he once said that Dwight Eisenhower isn't a conservative, he's a golfer. So yes, I think that Eisenhower, I mean, it's always hard to know, heck, you have people arguing about how God would vote. It's hard enough to know how earlier figures in our history would vote now. But, you know, judging from the arguments he made at the time he was president and shortly thereafter, I think he would have a real problem with the Tea Party view.
I have a question about political messaging. Why is it that progressives seem to fall so far short of the other side in political messaging? We have people like yourself who write scholarly op-ed articles, but then the other side coins a phrase like death panels, and it does more damage to an important political debate, and we don't recover. We don't respond with something in kind. What are we missing here? Can you educate us?
You know, I think all of us on either side always suspect the other side of playing tricks better than we do. Heck, the other side now thinks Obama makes up the unemployment numbers, you know? You know, so I'm not sure that they are terribly effective. And look at the trajectory of this campaign before the last debate. You know, 47% was hardly an effective argument that Mitt Romney made. And I think the response to that from not only, first of all, I think it's really interesting and heartening that many, many conservatives objected to that too. I think of my friend David Brooks, Mike Gerson, Chris Caldwell, a conservative who writes for the Financial Times, Henry Olson of the American Enterprise Institute. They all said, wait a minute, we can't abide this. This is not our form of conservatism. But I think what you saw come out of that was quite effective from the progressive side, and that progressives really were effective. I think the 1% was an ingenious invention, messaging invention of the left. So I don't think that progressives are always lame, but we are sometimes. I think there was a period where, but you know, it is a simple fact from the polling that at this moment in our history, if you poll Republicans about whether they want to reach compromise, they say no. And if you poll Democrats, they are much more likely to say yes. So there is a kind of asymmetry here where I do think that the Republican Party and the conservative movement have moved farther right than any kind of leftward movement by the left. Indeed, my reading of the polls is that the left has moved a little smidgen to the right, and the right has moved farther right still. And so it's that imbalance that I worry about, and that when you have that degree of imbalance in the debate, the tug is always to move further and further right. So I am kind of temperamentally moderate, and I've always admired moderate and liberal Republicans. I have conservative friends. I don't like a political climate where people are really hostile to each other, and yet I know the tone of my own writing has become sharper and sharper for the last 10 years, and for me, it has been a sense of crisis created by this movement, not personal crisis, political crisis, by this movement of the right to the right. So I think there is this imbalance. My friends Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, I thought, wrote about this really well in their book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And I love to quote Tom and Norm because I told them that, your book was really effective because you guys have spent your whole lives being so damned reasonable. Norm and Tom are not ultra-leftists. They have been very sensible, middle-of-the-road political scientists, and they are frustrated by this too. So I think there is, been a movement, a sharp movement right by the right. I don't think we are always lame. It goes in cycles. I think, there were a lot of good lines in that Bill Clinton speech at the Democratic Convention. He's pretty good at it. The president was pretty good at it in 2008. So, don't lose heart on that for that reason. Sir?
In his dialogue on the statesman, Plato, or Socrates, argues that the essence of governing is compromise, consensus. The more diverse views you get in the room, the better the final outcome will be if people will only come to consensus. To what do you ascribe the current absolute horror of compromise? We have people who think that to compromise is a violation of their principles. That's crazy, I think.
Well, thank you. In a way, I don't want to objectify Mr. Wood, who was good enough to write that first question, but I think you heard in him where the fear comes from, because if you believe, as he does and many other people do, and on principle, that those of us on the more progressive side really are trying to build a big tyrannical government, not to help people get health insurance, but to empower government itself, to make people dependent upon government in the future so that this group of professionals and members of public employee unions and God knows who else will maintain their grip on power. If you believe that about us, then it's very hard to compromise with us because it's sort of step by step by step into a world of dependency. You heard that in Paul Ryan's speech that was made public recently about makers and takers, and how we're going to cross a line at some point, and the takers are going to outvote the makers, and God knows what happens to us. And so I think and again, I'm obviously I take a very different view of this. I see the logic of how they get there, even though I can't get there myself. But I would like our conservative friends to back away from that, because I think on the left side, the left long ago made its peace with the free market. I mean, socialist parties around the world believe in the market. You don't have people talking about the public ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange anymore, and winning elections from the left. So we understand. We are willing to tell our conservative friends, and in the case of American liberalism was never anti-market. So we're willing to say, yes, we want the market to work. Yes, there are government programs that don't always work. Yes, sometimes contracting out works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we have too much of it. Sometimes we should try it. But so I think that that's why I argue that the fight is between balance and this radical individualism. And I would like to have a more reasonable fight. One example I give is, I don't see how you ever balance a budget without more revenue, substantially more revenue. One of the reasons is that there are so many people my age. No one would love more than I would to repeal the aging of the baby boomers. I think it would be a wonderful thing And I wish there were a government program that could just stop that process and we could live for a long time, keep paying taxes, not collect our Social Security, but I have not found anybody who can do that. So going to be a big bunch of us, just like we cost taxpayers a lot of money when we went through school, and they had to build a lot of schools for us, so we are going to be a burden. Now, we can sort of means test a little bit. We can certainly do more to try to contain healthcare costs, but we're going to be a big, we will be a drain on government. So how are we going to pay for that? Now, if our conservative friends could agree that the government needs a significant chunk of revenue, and then we could have a big argument where they would probably favor, progressive consumption taxes or something, and those of us on the left side would say, no, there's actually more you could do with, say, a financial transactions tax. We could have a real debate about what the best way to do that is, and then we probably could compromise as to where this money would come from. But you've got to accept that premise to start out with. And at the moment, there are a lot of our friends on that side who just don't want to accept that premise.
In this crowd, someone should speak up for the Tea Party at some point, so I'll take on that
please.
job.
Yeah.
But you also note in the book that the Tea Party was also angry at George Bush and his era of republicanism, in addition to being unhappy with Obama and the election of Obama. But isn't there some virtue somewhere to some element of the Tea Party folks' unhappiness with what they perceive to be a hypocritical political process and perhaps a government that was spending more than it could afford to? Is there any merit to their argument?
Well, first of all, I was looking. I have I went out of my way at the beginning of the book and also at the end of the book to say that I was grateful to the Tea Party, and I also had respect for their interest in American history. And I think it's important for liberals to understand that their response wasn't simply to the election of Barack Obama. It was also a response to the perceived and real failures of President Bush. And I think there was a real potential debate that got short-circuited among conservatives over why did Bush fail. And I think the Tea Partiers won it quickly with the argument that Bush failed because he was a big government conservative. Now, a lot of that big government happened in Kirkuk and not Kansas. Nonetheless, that he spent a lot. He did the prescription drug benefit. No Child Left Behind was the centralized use of power. A lot of Tea Party members opposed his more open policies on immigration. So it is important to situate them as not simply a reaction against Obama, but also a reaction against President Bush. So that is part of it. The other thing about them is, in a way, they are not new at all. A lot of the Tea Party ideas can be traced back to the ideas that were in circulation among conservatives opposed to the New Deal. Some of their ideas, particularly as refracted by Mr. Beck, are old John Birch Society ideas. In the book, I quote a Tea Party activist who said, they call us extreme, but they said that about the Birch Society, too. And so, but in fairness, about 20% of us as Americans are going to be fairly, or are going to be very conservative. And so I think what was innovative about the Tea Party was the moment they arose, the fact that they had their own TV network in Fox News, they had a troupe of talk show hosts all over the country, they had a media absolutely obsessed with Sarah Palin, and whether you write about her at a moment's notice, she was good for page views because on the new media, because people who loved her and people who hated her all repaired to stories that had Sarah Palin's name in it. I once put her name in something that had nothing to do with anything I was writing, and then put a parenthesis, people might read this now, So yes, and they had frustrations. We were in the middle of a big economic downturn, yes, the deficit has gone up. Now, there are those of us on the other side who would say, take a look at those policies. Have 2 wars and 2 tax cuts, and you might get a deficit. But the deficit was up. And so the frustrations were real. A lot of these are perfectly good human beings. I'm not criticizing them as human beings. I suspect I would like, they and I might have a good time yelling at each other at a bar. But I do think that their views are not imperfectly captured by that lady who mentioned the Birch Society.
Could you comment on the way in which race has diverted us from this great American vital center that you describe?
Race is at the center of our story from the very, very beginning, and it never fully disappears, even though we have made progress. And I have a chapter, in fact, called "The Politics of History," where I talk about how the history of Reconstruction is a classic example of the political sphere interacting with the work of scholars and the work of scholars interacting with the political sphere. Because what was Reconstruction at the outset was an attempt to democratize the South, empower previously enslaved people, and create a more small d democratic South. And the redeemers, so-called, who came along afterward argued, no, this is not about liberating the South. This is about Northern oppressors empowering African Americans, whom they referred to much less politely than I just did, criticizing their capacity to govern. And that view came to dominate our history books for a long time. There was a whole view of Reconstruction and I quote some of the Reconstruction historians, some of them very distinguished historians, who talked about African Americans in the most really pretty despicable ways. That view dominated. It was there in the textbooks when I was a kid, which shows, it was finally starting to come out. And then there was a rebellion against this history. Kevin Stamp, a great historian, and some others said, wait a minute, this is a racist history. This isn't what really happened. African Americans actually were competent in governing themselves. They didn't have these rights imposed on them. They demanded these rights. And so finally, the real history of Reconstruction started coming out in the 50s and 60s, probably capped by Eric Foner's great book called Reconstruction. And that overlapped with the rise of the Civil Rights Movement. And I argue in the book that there is an interaction between the historians who are writing the new history and the Civil Rights Movement that was both inspiring them to write a new history and empowered by the more accurate history. But the other thing is it's always been connected to the power of the federal government. And the Whigs, for example, we had a long history in our country of the federal government providing disaster relief, going right back to the beginning. And then a large number of Southerners realized that if the federal government could do this, and I quote a Southern pro-slavery congressman saying, if the government can do this, then it can properly emancipate. So that at many moments in our history, opposition to federal power in all kinds of spheres was rooted in the fear, particularly in the South, that the federal government would come in and overturn peculiar Southern institutions, first slavery and then segregation. I had a quote from John Quincy Adams, who saw this very early on, but I won't find it in time. But so race is always there.
I think you wanted to talk about the debate.
Oh, well, no, actually, I should not have opened that door, as the debaters and the lawyers say. No, I'll say a word about where I think the election is, and include the debate in that. I think that this campaign started the day after the debt ceiling fight was settled. And in the book, I am critical of the parts of President Obama's early legacy where I did not think he was willing to acknowledge the nature of the fight he was in, and was prepared had more hope than was justified that a certain kind of bipartisanship could be achieved. At one point during some of those negotiations, I said, if I ever have to buy another house or another car, I don't think I'm going to ask the Obama administration to do the negotiating for me. Now, I think that was rooted in two things. I think that is who he is. I think he is a deeply non-divisive figure. I think the notion that he is some kind of radical is absurd, given his history, given who he is. I always like to say to people who call him a socialist, I said, I know socialists, and they're insulted when President Obama is called a socialist. you know, and that he was really hoping that this could work, and he thought it was part of what he had promised in the campaign. Well, after the debt ceiling fight, he said, this isn't working. Theory is wrong, and we have fundamental differences here. And he gave a whole series of speeches and laid out some proposals that really started drawing sharper lines with the Republicans. And I think that was very effective because he didn't make this up. These differences are real. The Republicans were making that argument from the other side without an answer. And without a set of alternatives. And, you know, one of the places he went in that period was to Osawatomie, Kansas, where Teddy Roosevelt, I was finishing the book, putting it to bed, and only the president of the Osawatomie Chamber of Commerce was happier than I was that he visited Osawatomie, because this fit in so neatly, that speech fit in so neatly with my argument about Teddy Roosevelt. So I found as I was writing the book, the president's position was coming closer and closer to mine. At the moment I started the book, I thought there was a need to speak, you know, to argue back. And so the debate, I had this very, you know, this may have been a very eccentric reaction on my part, but the Obama who appeared in the debate seemed much more like the Obama before the debt ceiling fight than the Obama who has been on the campaign trail. And it made me wonder a little bit what Obama would we see after the election. I don't think it was as uniformly awful as, you know, I think that you know, when we in the media make a choice, it gets, you know, the echo chamber is very large. But Obama gave the critics a lot of material to work with. And I think the biggest difficulty was the close. You know, he can do much better than that. I still don't understand. And also, I think there was a kind of passion missing that he can show, but didn't show in that debate. And they should not have been surprised, because Mitt Romney has been a good debater. He absolutely destroyed Newt Gingrich before the Florida primary, so that shouldn't have come as a surprise to them. Assuming better debate performances, I think the structure of the election favors Obama because of where the swing states are and what states Democrats can count on. If you look back for the last 20 years, no Democrats gotten less than 251 electoral votes. The Republicans had gotten as low as 159. Now, you know, correcting for population shifts, that 251 may be 245, and the 159 may be a little higher. But there are more secure Democratic states than there are secure Republican states, and that I think the best test of where this race is going to be what is the polling out of Ohio in the next 4 days, because I think it's really striking that the president has not been behind in Ohio for a very long. He's been ahead in Ohio for a very, very long time, and you know, and I think and I think there are a couple of key reasons for that. One is the auto rescue. I think it's very ironic that one of the least popular policies he pursued at the time that involved one of the clearest, most direct forms of government intervention into the economy, if he wins by carrying Ohio and Michigan, that will be the policy that probably had more to do with his reelection than almost anything else. And then the second is the advertising campaign they ran on Romney. You know, the old political consultants line, they defined Romney before Romney could define himself. And they turned his biggest asset, which is his experience in business, into a liability, raising questions about Bain, which Romney played into very effectively with the 47% comment. And so I think that's baked, you know, to a considerable degree into the cake. And I think it depends how much did Romney do to undo that, and can he do in 29 days to undo that. But I will just, you know, I just want to return to for one last moment, to the theme of the book. I do hope, you know, I said at the end of my talk that I really would like us to be able to recognize each other a little bit more than we do. And I do believe this notion of honoring our core sense of both community and liberty, you know, not seeing in the other an utter denial of either of those things is a way in which we could begin to reason together again, if one may invoke the prophet Isaiah. And I hope that after this election is over, we might try to begin settling things, because my biggest worry is that we may have to be fighting another 4 to 6 years. I don't mind fights. They're about democracy. Democracy has had moments of fighting. But I think we're at a really critical juncture in our history where there is no country that can cause American decline except for one, and that's the United States of America. I think only we can do that to ourselves. I think if we continue to govern ourselves in the way that we have been for the last decade, and I'm not ascribing that to any individual, I'm talking about this utter inability to reach any consensus at all on central questions, that's when we may have to worry that the declinists were right. But there's no reason for them to be right, and I think it's in our hands to make sure they're wrong. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.